If you see pink objects in your Blender scene, that means that the links to the external texture files have been broken. If the textures have been deleted, then that's a serious problem. But if they have just been moved to another location, then there is an easy fix. So I'll show you how to relink the external files and also how to pack such external files into your blend file, which may not always be a good idea, but it could be useful in some cases. Let's take a second to understand relative and absolute paths. Absolute paths are easy to follow. They are exactly what you would see in Windows Explorer, for example. So a texture file may be located in C drive, My Projects, Textures. Blender can work with absolute paths, but by default it uses relative paths. That is, a path relative to the location of the blend file itself. Here are examples of relative paths. And it's okay if you don't fully understand those. But for example, // means the same location as the blend file. And here a more complex example. This means that in the same location as the blend file, there is a textures folder, and inside it there is a my character folder, and inside it we have a texture. In this one, the 2 dots means go out of the current blend file folder. So here we go out of the blend file folder, and there we have the textures folder, and inside we have the actual texture. Relative paths are more useful when all external files are in a folder dedicated to the current project. Absolute paths may be better when the external files are in a separate library folder dedicated to just textures or just audio files and so on. Okay, let's look at an actual example. Here I have a scene with a character which has a texture and one more object with a random texture just to make things interesting. Now if I go to the shading tab and select the base color for this character and expand the properties, you'll see the path to this texture. And it's a relative path which is exactly in the same location as the blend file. And the same for this other object. If we look at the project folder, you'll see that it is exactly what is happening. We have these textures in the same location as the blend file. Now let's change things. I'm going to create a new folder called textures. I'll move the textures in there, and I'll even go in there and create new folders. One for the character and one for the cube. And I'll move the textures in there. So now if I go back to Blender, if I save this file and then reload it by pressing File, Revert, the objects will be pink because Blender lost the links to the textures. Now if I go to Shading, of course I can go to the base color and click Open, go to the Textures, Character, and select my texture. And that will apply the texture again. And in this scene, I have only 2 objects. I could easily do this manually, but imagine that you had hundreds of objects. We want an automated way to relink the textures. So I'm going to undo and again lose the link to this texture. And now to find missing textures, you can go to File, External Data, Find Missing Files. And in here, all you have to do is point to the folder which contains the textures. So I'm going to go into the Textures folder, and I'm going to press the Find Missing Files button. What is really cool is that Blender will go into the subfolders and find any textures that it needs. I don't need to do this process for each subfolder. So just press Find Missing Files, and that's it. All textures are relinked. And even if we had hundreds or thousands of objects, the process would be exactly the same. Just point to the top folder where the textures are located, and Blender will do the rest. By the way, in the same menu, external data, there is report missing file. So let's undo. And then I'm going to go to external data, report missing files. And now if I toggle the system console, you'll see that Blender will give me information about the missing files. I don't find this useful in general, but if you do, this is how we do it. What is more useful is actually finding the missing files. Find missing files, point to the textures directory, and that's it. Okay, as I said, Blender will make most paths relative by default. If you want to make a path absolute, You can go again to the shading workspace and let's select a texture. And here on the source, I'm going to click open again, select the texture, expand these options and uncheck relative path. And now you'll see that an absolute path is displayed. You can also set the path to absolute when you open new textures. So for example, here, if I add a new image texture node and open, and here I've added a new texture. If I expand these side options and uncheck relative path and then open the new texture, the path will be absolute by default. I tend to work with relative paths, but if you need absolute paths, this is how we do it. And Blender offers operators to make all paths either relative or absolute. So again, you can go to File, External Data, and here you have Make Paths Relative or Make Paths Absolute. If I press Make Paths Relative and look at this new texture that I opened as absolute, it is now being made relative. And same with this one. It is a relative path again. If I go to File, External Data, Make Paths Absolute, all paths will be absolute, including the texture of this guy, which was originally a relative path, now it is absolute. I prefer relative paths in this case, so I'll make them relative again. Something related to this topic is packing external files such as textures directly in the blend file. Here is how you can pack an individual texture in the blend file. Again, I'm going to look at the texture properties, and here on the source, I'll click this button and it will change, and that will mean that the texture is now packed in the blend file. And so this material is no longer using the external texture that it used to use. So for example, if I make changes to this texture, for example, I change the color and save it, it will not be reflected here in the blend file. I could go to Texture Paint and make changes to this texture directly in Blender. That's another topic. But the material no longer uses the external texture. And I know there are many different workflows, but personally, I would only pack the external files into the blend file if I'm sending this file to someone else. And this someone else needs to easily open this file with all of its dependencies without worrying about project structure and so on. And if I was doing this, I wouldn't pack the textures one by one manually. I would just go to File, again, External Data, and Pack Resources. And it may ask you to confirm. Okay, now, even if I go to my project folder and delete my textures folder, and then save this file and reopen it, the textures will all be there. Because they're packed in the blend file, they don't depend on any external files. And now I'm ready to send this file to a client or to someone else that needs to render it, for example. I'm not very experienced with render farms, but that may be another case where this can be useful. Now let's say that you received such a file which contains embedded data. If you want to extract this data and take a good look at it or maybe edit it, what you could do is again go to File, External Data, and then Unpack Resources. And I'm not going to go through all of these options one by one. The one I usually use is the first one. And now if I look again in my project folder, Blender has created a textures folder and all of the textures are there. Now if I edit any of these textures, and save it and then reload this file, you'll see that the model is affected by this change because the material is using the external file.